Smallpox, Part 4A.
Around 1000 CE, as recorded as in the oldest documents that can possibly be found, it suggested that in Asia, or possibly India, a procedure called variolation was used to deliberately expose a person to a small amount of infectious material from a smallpox patient to confer some type of active natural immunity. Variolation could be done by inhalation, where you would take the scabs from a smallpox patient, smallpox scabs, grind them up into a powder, blow them into the nose, or variolation could be performed by inoculation. Take a small amount of pussy drainage from a smallpox pustule, or some of the dried scab material, make a small incision or cut into usually someone's arm, and rub that smallpox material into that wound. The idea was to expose a person to a small amount of sort of controlled amount of smallpox material. They would often get sick, but not nearly as sick, usually, as if they contracted the disease in the normal, natural fashion of modes of transmission. This process of variolation by inhalation or inoculation conferred a great deal of protection on patients who received this procedure. As such, in countries where variolation became popular or prevalent, smallpox, especially in the Far East and the Middle East, began to become a childhood illness, because most adults were variolated as children, and as such, even though they did get sick for a while with mild symptoms of smallpox, they certainly didn't suffer the high mortality of naturally occurring smallpox, and grew up to be healthy adults. So they would resist any kind of smallpox epidemic, or if it occurred in the community, those individuals already had natural immunity and didn't get sick. It was just the young children who hadn't been variolated yet who were more susceptible. So again, Middle East and Far East, by the time we get to around 1100, 1200 CE, smallpox is simply a childhood illness that can be prevented by variolation. During the age of exploration in the late 1400s, early 1500s, ships from European countries are traveling across the Atlantic looking for gold and other valuable materials in what we now identify as the New World, or North and South America. Unfortunately, all the native populations in both North and South America had never experienced smallpox. Smallpox had only spread throughout European, Mediterranean, Middle Eastern, and Asian continents. Exposure to these essentially untested populations in North and South America would lead to what's now called virgin soil epidemics, with these very susceptible individuals whose ancestors had never encountered this kind of disease organism before. Mortalities ranged from 50% on up to almost 100%. Huge populations of people died as a result of exposure to smallpox. Clearly, one good example is when Hernando Cortez and his conquistadors arrived from Spain in about 1519. At first, the relationship between some of the native populations, including the Aztecs, was fairly amicable. The Aztecs were very powerful and warrior-like individuals. Really hadn't had any conflict that they couldn't overcome. But unfortunately, along with some of the novel weaponry, the attack dogs, the horses that were trained in warfare, as well as the conquistadors. The Spanish also brought with them smallpox. The Aztecs, including their leader Montezuma and his close relatives, who were heir apparent, all eventually either succumbed to the disease or so many citizens died because of the disease. Eventually Montezuma had to, who was the leader of the Aztecs at the time, essentially capitulate and surrender his leadership and all of his worldly goods to the Spaniards. Hundreds, if not thousands, of individuals perished, and we find this particular event, or these series of events, are going to change the outcome of Central America and lead to essentially what we now recognize as the country of Mexico, with its Spanish heritage. Once introduced into Central America, the smallpox illness moved south along trade routes from the Aztecs to other populations all the way down to the Inca populations and other native tribes in South America. In 1525, smallpox had reached the Inca civilization. One of the emperors and most of his family and heir apparent died as a result. The Inca population before smallpox is estimated to have been about 7 million. By the time we get to essentially maybe 7 to 10 years after the introduction of smallpox, that 7 million population was reduced to around 500,000 after repeated epidemic outbreaks of smallpox in the native population. When Francisco Pizarro, and his roughly 200 soldiers arrived in Peru to essentially claim the territory in 1532, they met with hardly any resistance at all, because there just weren't enough soldiers and enough natives to defend their territories. When the Spanish arrived in roughly 1522-1521, it's estimated that the Central American population had about 25 million inhabitants, Aztec and all the local tribes. Roughly a century later, in 1620, local populations are estimated at 1.6 million. This is after roughly maybe 4 or 5 generations of native populations essentially replacing those individuals that were lost due to disease. So you can imagine that in 1520, when smallpox is ravaging through the countryside and all the native local folks, that the few survivors at the time must have been in the hundreds of thousands that could eventually lead to the repopulation a century later of about 1.6 million. A huge loss in productivity, arts, abilities that we just don't know, couldn't even imagine have been lost over the centuries. Knowledge, quite a bit is lost when huge populations of people die as a result of epidemics and pandemics. In the 16 and 1700s, the knowledge and practice of variolation spread from the Middle East and the Far East to areas closer to Europe. procedure was not well adopted or well accepted. And in fact, because of the countries of origin of the procedure, oftentimes it was more of a cultural difference or bias that prevented variolation from being accepted by European countries. In 1717, Lady Mary Montagu, who was the wife of the British ambassador to Turkey, living in Constantinople at the time, observed variolation and noted that parents of children routinely had their children variolated in Turkey to prevent them from having smallpox. She realized it was a relatively safe procedure and certainly less harmful or dangerous than having full-blown smallpox, as she herself could attest, since in 1715 she had a severe case of smallpox, which left her seriously disfigured due to the pock marks and scarring on her face. Prior to her contracting smallpox, Mary Montagu was quite the socialite and very famous for her beautiful skin and her art and essentially her appreciation for the finer things in life. When in Turkey, after noticing and observing variolation, and wanting to keep her son and her children from experiencing and suffering from smallpox as she did, in 1718 she had her son variolated by the British physician and surgeon Charles Maitland, who was the embassy surgeon in
Constantinople, variolated her son with good outcome and no undue hazard or illness on the part of her son. Upon returning to Great Britain in 1721, in the intervening year or so she had returned, Mary Montagu lobbied diligently with the royal family in Great Britain to introduce and to adopt variolation as a means of reducing the occurrence of smallpox, especially in children. To prove the effectiveness and safety, Mary had Charles Maitland variolate her daughter in 1721 in the presence of the Princess Caroline and some of the other royal family to demonstrate how safe and effective this procedure was. Her daughter, again, did not suffer any undue hardship or adverse effect, and Princess Caroline still wasn't convinced, so it was decided to do what we would today call some clinical trials. First, they selected 6 condemned prisoners. The condemned prisoners were told that if they survived the procedure of variolation, they would be released upon successful completion of the test for the procedure. The 6 prisoners were variolated successfully. None had any undue outward or adverse effects and were then thus set free. Still not convinced, because these were adults that were being tested, Princess Caroline did want to have her children variolated, but was not convinced that this was still a safe procedure for children. Even though she had seen Mary Montagu's daughter and knew that her son, Mary's son, had been variolated, still wasn't convinced, because the royal children were, of course, particularly special. So a dozen orphans were selected. Now, the orphans did not really have any say, or I don't think they accepted volunteers as they did with the prisoners. The information that we have in the history is that the 12 orphans were simply selected and variolated randomly to see if there were any adverse effects of this procedure in children. Sure enough, there were none. And by 1722, slowly but surely, variolation as a means of protection against smallpox began to slowly become an acceptable practice in Great Britain, and then was introduced into Europe and areas and countries east of Great Britain.
across the Atlantic Ocean in the British colonies. In 1721, Cotton Mather, who was a very learned reverend or preacher at the time, had read about and had learned about variolation, particularly from one of his slaves. In African countries, variolation was a well-accepted procedure at the time. On reading about the effectiveness of variolation, Cotton Mather persuaded a local physician, Zebdiel Boylston, to variolate some local citizens, despite the extreme public resistance to the procedure. As it turned out, smallpox had been introduced into the Boston local area, which is where all of this was taking place in Massachusetts, and an epidemic was in the development, or beginning to develop, and variolation could definitely have been effective at reducing the mortality and morbidity at the time. Cotton Mather even wrote an account of the method and success of inoculating the smallpox, and listed the support of Thomas Jefferson, who definitely was very pro-variolation. In fact, Jefferson himself traveled for many, many days to come from Virginia to Pennsylvania just to get variolated as a young man. Even with all these pro-variolation sentiments, the procedure was still viewed by some local folks as maybe not a really safe practice. There was a lot of sort of bias or criticism about the procedures because people just didn't understand or know what really was going on when someone was deliberately exposed to a small amount of smallpox material. In Boston in 1722, another smallpox epidemic ravages through the town, and this time there are sufficient numbers of individuals who had either been variolated or not variolated. And to demonstrate some of the effectiveness, statistics were developed to demonstrate whether or not variolation really was something to be chosen as a deliberate means of protection. Sure enough, what the physicians at the time found is that if you took folks who were unimmunized and compared the total number of sick, the prevalence, and the mortality of the unimmunized population and compared the prevalence and mortality to the immunized population, it was anywhere from 7 to 25 times difference in numbers. 54% prevalence in the unimmunized group, 2% prevalence in the immunized group. 14% mortality in the unimmunized group, 2.5% mortality in the immunized group. A clear difference between the two. There's no question that variolation by inoculation was effective. Unfortunately, at the time, even though individuals, very learned individuals like Thomas Jefferson, were very pro-variolation, there were also some other scientists and individuals who opposed it. Benjamin Franklin was one of those. In fact, he continued to oppose variolation because of the risks that also were incurred, until in 1736 his favorite son died of smallpox. Franklin contributed to the statistical studies, eventually determining that variolation was very effective, unfortunately too late for his son, and becomes quite a lobbyist promoting variolation. In 1753, smallpox erupts again in epidemics that run essentially up and down the coast of North America. As it turns out, just as we see in South America, in North America, the native populations are highly susceptible and have a much higher mortality and prevalence than the European populations that were occupying the colonies at the time.